Tom Semelian. I'm the Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences here. We're very pleased to be hosting this event with the Open Society Foundation of Armenia, and our special guest today is Aryé Nayer, who is President Emeritus of the Open Society Foundation. He was president from 1993 to 2012. Previously, he served for 12 years as Executive Director of Human Rights Watch, of which he founded in 1978. He worked 15 years at the American Civil Liberties Union, including 8 years as National Executive Director. He served as an adjunct professor of law at New York University for more than a dozen years and has taught at Georgetown University Law School and the University of Siena in Italy. Since 2012, he has served as a distinguished visiting professor at the Paris School of International Affairs of Sciences, Po, Social Sciences at Po. Mr. Nayer is a frequent contributor to the New York Review of Books and has published in periodicals such as the New York Times Magazine, the New York Times Book Review, and Foreign Policy. For a dozen years, he wrote a column on human rights for The Nation. He has contributed more than 300 op-ed articles in newspapers including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, and the International Herald Tribune. Author of 7 books, including his most recent, The International Human Rights Movement, A History, in 2012. Nayer has also contributed chapters to more than 20 books. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished guest to AUA. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm going to talk about promoting human rights in an era of terrorism. And I say at the outset, it is extremely difficult to promote human rights in an era of terrorism. A purpose of terrorism, the purpose, is to create fear, and to create fear that goes far beyond the actual toll that terrorism takes in terms of human life and human injuries. Terrorism is something we see as somewhat random. It can affect people at any place, at any time, and it naturally inspires efforts to try to control it or try to suppress it by using strict methods of law enforcement in order to suppress the terrorists and in order to apprehend them, and once apprehending them, to extract information from them so as to prevent additional terrorist acts. And of course, it's quite natural that a society should try to defend itself as well as it possibly can against terrorism. But when one raises objections to some of the methods that may be used to try to prevent terrorism on the grounds that they violate human rights, there is a tendency to regard human rights concerns as not necessarily so significant when dealing with a threat that is as great, as substantial as the threat posed by terrorism. And so on that ground, on that basis, it is very difficult to promote human rights in an era of terrorism. I want to say a little bit about the history of efforts to promote human rights in order to put into context the question of promoting human rights in an era of terrorism. Most of you are aware that the principal international agreements on human rights were adopted roughly 70 years ago in the aftermath of World War II. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted in 1948, and other significant international agreements, such as the Genocide Convention, were adopted in about the same period. But it took quite a while longer before any significant movement emerged to promote human rights. And that didn't take place until about the mid-1970s. So the effort to promote human rights systematically is something that has been underway for about 40 years. It was at that point that governments, such as the government of the United States, undertook an effort to promote human rights internationally. It was also around that period that many of the non-governmental organizations that are devoted to the promotion of human rights came into being. Amnesty International was created somewhat earlier in 1961, but Amnesty International acquired much greater recognition in 1977 when it won the Nobel Peace Prize, and that enabled it to become truly worldwide in its operations and in its efforts to promote human rights. And the organization with which I was long associated, Human Rights Watch, was established in that period in the 1970s. We were established in 1978. And there are non-governmental organizations all over the world which were established in that period. In the early years of the effort to promote human rights, the effort was largely dominated by the Cold War circumstances of that period. And one of the roles that the human rights movement helped to serve during that period is it restructured the Cold War debate into a debate over liberty or open society versus totalitarianism. In the early years of the Cold War, the struggle between East and West was often portrayed in economic terms, in terms of communism versus capitalism, or communism versus free enterprise. And that changed over a period of time, and the human rights movement was not the only factor by any means in bringing about that change, but it did contribute to that change. And it seemed in that era to be somewhat aligned with the Western societies, the Western governments, which were portraying themselves as the champions of liberty against those who were accused of totalitarian rule. But the West had significant flaws of its own, and the human rights movement in that period simultaneously criticized the Western governments for their support of military dictatorships in many parts of the world, military dictatorships in Latin America, military dictatorships in a number of Asian countries, the apartheid regime in South Africa, and so forth. And in effect, the human rights movement said to the Western governments that you are somewhat fraudulent in your claim to represent liberty if you are supporting these military dictatorships that engage in significant human rights abuses. And the effect over a period of time was to require the Western governments to end their support for many of those military dictatorships. And this had a substantial impact. During the course of the 1980s, for example, in Latin America, at the beginning of the decade, virtually every country was a military dictatorship. And then by the end of the decade, by 1990, when Pinochet was ousted in Chile, virtually every country in Latin America had shifted from a military dictatorship into a democracy that more or less respected human rights. The same phenomenon took place in a number of Asian countries, so countries like South Korea and the Philippines and Taiwan had been military dictatorships at the beginning of the 1980s, and they were transformed during that period. And of course, the 1980s ended with the collapse of the Soviet system, with the countries of Eastern Europe becoming independent of the Soviet Union and overthrowing the communist system. And then in 1991, with the disintegration of the Soviet Union itself. And change also began to take place in other parts of the world. In 1990, the South African government felt that it had to free Nelson Mandela from prison and legalize the African National Congress. And that, in effect, spelled the end of apartheid in South Africa. And in turn, the developments in South Africa spurred democracy movements and human rights movements in other parts of Africa. Not everything went well. At the point that the human rights movement had started to become significant in the mid-1970s, China was still engaged in the Cultural Revolution, and even after the end of the Cultural Revolution in 1976, it would have been foolhardy to suggest that one could promote human rights in China. But a human rights movement did take hold in China in the 1980s, and it culminated in the events that took place in Tiananmen Square in 1989. But of course, the Chinese government crushed the democracy movement in Tiananmen Square. But for the most part, the efforts of the human rights movement during its first decade and a half of significant activity had very substantial results. They had a transforming effect on substantial parts of the world. And then we entered a post-Cold War period in the 1990s. Some of us who were active in the human rights field felt that we were entering a golden period in the protection of human rights. We were brought back to earth by the developments in the former Yugoslavia, by the Rwandan genocide that took place during 1994. But it was still possible for the the non-governmental human rights movement to secure significant cooperation from the Western governments in efforts to promote human rights. So the United States and many of the European governments were in that period allies of the human rights movement in the promotion of human rights. And then we entered another era, the era that we are still living in today, which began with the terrorist attacks on New York and Washington in September 2001. Of course, there had been significant terrorist attacks elsewhere prior to what happened in September of 2001. But what took place then was on a scale that was far greater than anything we had previously experienced. 3,000 people were killed, a great many more were injured, billions of dollars of property were destroyed, and many people said at the time, the world will never be the same again. And I think looking back on that 15 years later, we would have to say the world has not been the same since, and may never be the same again. The United States reacted to the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, both in terms of the way it dealt with alleged terrorists directly, and in the way in which it acted internationally. As far as the suspected terrorists were concerned, the United States took into custody quite a large number of people in different parts of the world, some in Afghanistan, some in other countries, held them at various secret locations, brought a significant number of them to Guantanamo, and since then, even though 15 years have elapsed, hardly anyone who was brought to Guantanamo was ever actually brought to trial. By now, about 90% of those who were held at Guantanamo were released, and in most cases they were either released because the United States ultimately decided, after they had been held for substantial periods, that there was no basis for holding them, or they were released because if the United States thought there was a substantial basis for holding them, it thought that they no longer posed any kind of danger, and therefore it released them. And there are now about 80 people left at Guantanamo, and the United States would like to release close to half of those who are still held there. And the main reason it hasn't released them is it doesn't know where to send them. A good many of them are Yemenis. Yemen has its own conflict, doesn't want those people to return, can't guarantee their safety if they return, so finding someplace else to send them has been the issue. Recently, several of them were sent to the country of Oman that is near Yemen, but I think Oman took as many as it felt it could handle. There were other things that the United States did, and the most important was that it invaded Iraq in 2003. For a period, it suggested that there was a connection between the Iraqi government of Saddam Hussein and the terrorist acts of September 11. That argument could not be sustained. It also argued for a period that it went to war in Iraq because Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. It turned out that that argument could not be sustained. It eventually retreated to the idea that Saddam Hussein was a brutal dictator, which was certainly true, and that it was intent on establishing democracy in Iraq. If that was its purpose, it hasn't worked very well. Things have continued to go bad in Iraq. The number of people who are killed and injured and forcibly displaced continues to grow in Iraq. They are now enormous numbers, and whether and to what degree the invasion of Iraq ultimately led to the formation of the Islamic State is something one could debate, but it certainly was a factor in the emergence of the Islamic State. And the United States also discredited itself in the year following the invasion of Iraq when photographs were obtained of the torture that took place at Abu Ghraib. And the photographs of torture and sexual humiliation at Abu Ghraib, I think, have permanently damaged the United States. And the consequence of all these things, the long-term detentions without trial at Guantanamo, the invasion of Iraq and the disaster that has resulted from the invasion of Iraq, and the torture that took place at Abu Ghraib have greatly diminished both the will and the capacity of the United States to engage as a proponent of the protection of human rights. In an earlier period, the United States often criticized governments for engaging in abuses of human rights because of threats to their national security. But it doesn't go over as well to criticize others for engaging in such practices when one's own reputation has been so much shaped by the practices of the United States itself. Terrorism, in my view, has, if anything, been served by the way in which a government such as that of the United States has demeaned itself or limited itself in its capacity to promote human rights. When one thinks of the terrorists, one has to think about why they engage in such acts. And one of the things that to me is especially significant is that so many of the terrorists today commit suicide in the process of engaging in terrorism. That is, when they commit a terrorist act, they don't live to see the consequences of their own acts. They commit suicide in the process. And of course, their actions are that much more devastating because they commit suicide. That is, they're able to engage in acts that cause far more harm because of their willingness to get themselves blown up or to get themselves killed in the course of committing terrorist acts. The question of suicide attacks is not something which has a long history. The first time that we know of that there was a systematic effort by people engaged in attacks to commit suicide in the process is in the Japanese kamikaze attacks during World War II. And several thousand Japanese pilots volunteered to be kamikazes and to use their planes as weapons to dive into American ships and British ships, and therefore try to sink the ships, and sometimes to do so successfully in the process of their attacks. One of the things that is of interest so far as kamikaze attacks are concerned is that when they occurred, it was very late during World War II. It was in the final year of the war, when it was already apparent that Japan had lost the war. Japan had been defeated. And there has been speculation about why the pilots were willing to commit suicide in this way, and some have attributed this to loyalty to the emperor of Japan. I don't think that's very persuasive, to the degree that it has been possible to interview some of the survivors of those attacks. What the pilots themselves said was that at that point they thought they were helping to prevent American atrocities against their families. And it had been the case during the war with Japan that the United States had firebombed quite a lot of Japanese cities, and many of the cities were primarily constructed out of wooden houses during that period, and therefore firebombing was especially lethal. The most or the largest number of kamikaze attacks took place during the Battle of Okinawa in spring 1945, right after March 9, 1945, when the United States had firebombed Tokyo. And it's estimated that about 100,000 people were killed in the huge fires in Tokyo that were created by the firebombing. Probably as many or more as died in the dropping of the atomic bombs later on the year on civilian population centers, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And in fact, among the reasons that Hiroshima and Nagasaki were selected for the atomic bombs is that those cities had not previously been firebombed, and therefore it was more possible to measure the results of the atomic bombs than would have been the case in a city that was firebombed. And so it was a kind of desperate measure by these kamikaze pilots to ward off what they thought would be atrocities, and they were willing to commit suicide in order to do that. And the next significant use of suicide attacks, and the first time that we know of that they were used for terrorist purposes, took place in the war in Sri Lanka. The war in Sri Lanka started in 1983, and it was an effort by the Tamil minority to secure liberation against what they considered to be Sinhalese oppression. And the Tamil Tigers engaged in suicide bombings during that period. Again, it was a desperation measure in a losing cause. Eventually, the Tamil Tigers were wiped out by the Sri Lankan armed forces about 25 years after the conflict started in Sri Lanka. And at the time, there was an almost genocidal attack on Tamil civilians as well as on the Tamil Tigers. And it suggests that these previous episodes of suicide bombings are desperation measures by those who engage in them. If one thinks in terms of the suicide attacks that have occurred in the contemporary period of terrorism, one has to wonder whether they are also desperation attacks and whether this reflects strong resentments that have been built up in those who are engaged in terrorism. An interesting fact is that there doesn't seem to have been any involvement of refugees in the terrorist attacks. If one looks at the terrorist attacks that took place recently in Paris and in Brussels, for example, they seem to be second-generation immigrants from North Africa. And those people, in some ways, ought to have been better integrated into to Belgian society and into French society than many of the other Muslims in those countries, because coming from North Africa, most of them spoke French when they came to Belgium and France, and ought to have had better opportunities to integrate. But in fact, if you go to Brussels and to Paris, one of the things you see regularly on the streets is that people who look North African are stopped on the streets by the police, asked to explain themselves, and searched by the police. If you go to various metro stations in Paris and you stand there for a while, you will see people who look as though they're North African coming out of the metro and being approached by police and being subjected to searches. And that kind of thing seems to have built up significant resentments. When there are substantial human rights abuses, when you have abuses like arbitrary detentions, long-term detention at Guantanamo, torture at Abu Ghraib, those kinds of things feed resentments. And one guesses that the kinds of people who are willing to engage in suicide in order to engage in terrorist acts are products of those resentments. In my view, the human rights abuses that take place on an ongoing basis in order to try to cope with the problem of terrorism, in fact, are counterproductive. They make matters worse. Perhaps the most significant way in which they make matters worse is that if we are to control terrorism, one of the things we need is information from people who know what the potential terrorist is doing. It is their family members, their neighbors, the people with whom they associate who are most likely to know when they are trying to acquire the resources with which to engage in terrorist acts, when they are engaged in planning for terrorist acts to take place. And it is essential that those persons should go to the law enforcement authorities and provide information. But if one builds up resentments by constant police searches, by well-publicized human rights abuses against Muslims of the sort that have taken place during this era of terrorism, the likelihood that those family members and those neighbors and those friends will come forward and provide crucial information to the law enforcement authorities that can help to forestall terrorist acts is very substantially reduced. Often when one thinks about terrorism and human rights, one thinks about the need for security measures on the one hand, and one thinks about the need for protection of human rights on the other hand. And the two are seen in opposition to each other. The two are seen to conflict with each other. In my view, that's a false picture. I think, in fact, that the protection of human rights, and certainly one has to engage in vigorous law enforcement, but it has to be vigorous law enforcement that has the substance and the appearance of fairness. Because if it does not have the substance and appearance of fairness, it is likely to produce precisely the resentments which make people willing to engage in suicide in order to commit terrorist acts and in order to cause as much devastation as possible. And it causes those who have information that could be crucial in preventing terrorist acts to withhold that information from those who could use it in order to prevent terrorist attacks. So it's difficult to promote human rights at the same during an era of terrorism. And yet I think the fact of terrorism and the need to prevent terrorism ought to make us more vigilant, more concerned with protecting human rights rather than less concerned and less vigilant to protect human rights. Thank you very much.
We'll have some time for questions. There are microphones on both sides. Please line up and ask the question. Take more time to take those. Maybe 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 10 minutes? 10 minutes for questions. Any questions? I note that the students have staged a silent protest. Any comments on this?
I'm always for silent protests. I think it's a good way to do things.
Yeah, I'll ask a question.
Yes.
My name is Valentina. Thank you very much for being here, sir. If terrorism is the greatest challenge, if we can so conclude or dare to conclude, greatest challenge to the human rights movement, what would you name to be the second challenge that the society should be vigilant about? Would you say it's the not very much?
We have seen recently the rise of sort of strongman leadership in a number of significant countries. So that if you think of Xi Jinping in China, if you think of Putin in Russia, if you think of Erdogan in Turkey, if you think of Sisi in Egypt, these kinds of figures had not been dominant in the international scene for a substantial period. You have to go back a significant period in order to see the emergence of figures of that sort. And I think it's important to challenge those figures, and people within the countries where those persons are dominant often have great difficulty in challenging them. But outside those countries, it is possible for the international community to respond in a different way to figures of that sort. And the fact that there seems to be a kind of deference to those figures that is now being demonstrated internationally seems to me to be a very disturbing development.
There we go. This is on. Hello. Thank you for your talks. I have a question for you, and I'm a human rights lawyer, and you're going to see my bias. My question is there, in this new era, the new world that we're in, is there any actual novelty of the threat of terrorism that justifies increased or different infringements on human rights? We've had terrorism and concerns of national security for centuries, and the modern human rights system has developed over the last decades with terrorism, with the European Court of Human Rights cases regarding the Irish Troubles being a great example of that. So is this a situation now where we have to think differently, where it's a schism, or is it really more of a continuation of the past, and we can, the people nowadays should look to the lessons that were dealt with in the past regarding terrorism and the balance of national security and human rights? Thank you.
Primarily, when we have thought of criminal activity, we think of the punitive system of the law as a means to deter criminal activity. The question that arises with respect to terrorism is the punitive threat a deterrent to those who are willing to kill themselves in the process of committing their crimes. And so when one deals with terrorism, to a certain extent, one has to accept the idea that prevention, and not just punishment, is the crucial factor. That punishment in and of itself is not sufficient to engage in prevention, and that certain activities which are particularly focused on prevention are legitimate in dealing with terrorism. Unfortunately, one goes too far in that direction. The reason, or a reason, that the Bush administration in the United States was willing to engage in what they called enhanced interrogation, which other people would call torture, of suspected terrorists, is they never thought of bringing the terrorists to trial, and therefore they weren't concerned about doing things which would make it impossible to get a criminal conviction, because they simply weren't concerned about criminal convictions. Their view was you had to prevent the terrorist act, and if you engaged in torture, you might get information that would be valuable in actually preventing terrorism. Now, those who have examined the results of their activities have said that, in fact, they can't show any cases in which they actually prevented a terrorist attack through enhanced interrogation or torture. A committee of the Senate of the United States examined this, eventually released a report which ran to more than 3,000 pages. Only a 500 or 600 page summary of that report was ever made public. But the detailed investigation that they engaged in showed no case in which terrorist acts were prevented by torture. But that's what led them in that direction. And again, I don't dispute the idea that punishment per se can't be the only approach to terrorism, that it is crucial that one prevent the next terrorist attack. I think the best way to prevent terrorist attacks are, one, not to have the people who engage in terrorism engage in those acts, and two, to be able to get information from others who might know about these acts before they are committed. But I don't dispute the ultimate idea that prevention is crucial.
Մարի Մանուկյան, Open Society Foundations. Thank you for the lecture. I wanted to ask whether about our work and about the politicization of the human rights, and whether we need to adjust our work in any way.
I'm sorry?
Politicization of human rights, and
Yes.
whether we need to adjust our work, name it differently or call it differently, whether we have to do it or not.
You know, the Open Society Foundations engage in a great amount of activity in all parts of the world. And the human rights work that is done is a large part of the overall activity of the foundations. In some cases, we do the work directly through the different foundations or through the Open Society Justice Initiative. In some cases, we do it by grant making to other institutions. I think all of the bodies that engage in this activity are constantly in the process of adjusting their work, reevaluating their work, trying to find ways to make it more effective. I don't have a magical solution which would say, here is the one big approach that one should follow, which is going to be a major adjustment that would be a significant improvement on what is being done. I think there are a great variety of initiatives that are always taking place, and I'm always in the position of learning from the different initiatives proposed by the many different institutions that engage in this activity. It's not a hierarchical, top-down kind of an effort. It's an effort that emanates from many different places in many different parts of the world, and it seems to me collectively it plays a significant role in trying to protect human rights. Yes.
Yes, in English. Hello, my name is Abel Simonian, and I have this kind of question. This year is very crucial year for the USA because you have elections, upcoming presidential elections. So among other questions, one of the most important questions are the fight with ISIS. So, I was watching the primaries, presidential primaries, and one of and the Republican nominee, Donald Trump, said that American invasion of the Iraq caused the creation of ISIS. So what do you think? Was that creation a major factor that contributed to the creation of ISIS?
I think a lot of things entered into the creation of ISIS, and I don't think I'm in a position, and I don't think anyone is in a position right now to say how much of a role was played by different factors in the creation of ISIS. I think it's going to take us quite a long time to be able to figure that out. I do think that destabilizing the entire region by launching the Iraq War and not being prepared for the aftermath of the Iraq War and the kinds of mistakes that were made in the effort to administer Iraq played a significant part. I can't tell you how large a part. I can't say, whether that was the most important part, but I think it was a contributing factor in the emergence of ISIS. I do think that it's crucial for the United States, when it engages in any activity, to think about not only what it will accomplish through that activity, but how it will shape the perception of the United States internationally. And I think that the war in Iraq did more damage in shaping the perception of the United States than anything that had happened since the war in Vietnam. The war in Vietnam ended 41 years ago, and the war in Vietnam had a terrible effect on the image of the United States internationally, and to some extent by embracing the human rights cause in the aftermath of the war in Vietnam, the United States rebuilt its reputation internationally. And then I think, having rebuilt its reputation internationally, it then destroyed its reputation internationally, or substantially destroyed its reputation internationally by launching a war that did not seem to be justified on the basis of the arguments that were being put forward for that war. That is, the connection of Saddam Hussein to the events of 9/11 and the presence of weapons of mass destruction. So I think we're still living with the consequences of the bad decision that was made to launch the war in Iraq. But as I say, there may have been other factors that loomed comparably large, and it'll take the judgment of history. There had been a famous episode in which Zhou Enlai, the Chinese premier, was once asked about what was the effect of the French Revolution, and his answer was, "It's too soon to tell." And I think we're in a similar position.
Okay. Շատ շնորհակալություն ձեր հետաքրքիր եւ ուշագրավ ուրեմն զեկույցի համար։ Կարծում եմ ժամանակաշրջանը այնպիսին է, որ իսկապես ձեր վերլուծությունը այսօրվա ժամանակակից աշխարհի վերաբերյալ շատ կարևոր էր եւ նաեւ մեզ համար ուսուցանող։
Ուրեմն քանի որ վաղը չեմ մյուսօր մեր ցեղասպանության 101-րդ տարելիցն է մոտենում եւ դա մեր հայերիս համար ազգային ամենակարևորագույն ուրեմն իրադարձություններից մեկն է, չեմ կարող չանդրադառնալ այս հարցին եւ մեր ուրեմն ուսանողների կոչերը նույնպես ինձ ստիպեցին, որ ես այդ հարցին անդրադառնամ։ Ուրեմն Վուդրո Վիլսոնի իրավարար վճռի մասին եմ ուզում խոսել ձեզ հետ եւ հայոց պահանջատիրությունը ամբողջությամբ իրավական առումով արտացոլված է Ամերիկայի նախագահներից Վուդրո Վիլսոնի ու իրավարար վճռի մեջ եւ կուզենայի ձեր շեշտադրումը ինչ եք կարծում, ինչն է գլխավոր քաղաքական պատճառը, որ Ամերիկան այսքան տարի անց չի ուզում ճանաչել հայոց ցեղասպանությունը, դա առաջին հարց եւ ինչ է հարկավոր անել եւ այդ ուղղությամբ արդյոք միջազգային հանրության, հասարակության ավելի ակտիվ դրսևորումների կարիքը չկա եւ ինչ եք կարծում, ինչ պետք է անի հայ հասարակությունը, հայ քաղաքական ուրեմն միտքը, որպեսզի կարողանա այդ խնդիրը Ամերիկայի Միացյալ Նահանգներին ավելի հասանելի դարձնել եւ երկրորդ հարցս կուզենամ ուրեմն խոսել միջազգային հանրության իրավական պատասխանատվության ինստիտուտների կիրառման հետ կապված, ուրեմն վերջին արցախյան իրադարձությունները 4-օրյա պատերազմները, երբ որ ադրբեջանական կողմից հստակ ագրեսիայի դրսևորումներ եղան, այնտեղ հայ զինվորների ուրեմն ականջների կտրումների այդպիսի պրոցեսներ, խոշտանգումներ, խաղաղ բնակչության եւ այլն եւ այդ ամբողջ իրադարձություններին միջազգային հանրության արձագանքը հիմնականում կոչերի տեսքով էր։ Արդյոք չեք գտնում որպես Ամերիկայի Միացյալ Նահանգների ուրեմն վառ ներկայացուցիչ հանրության վերլուծաբան, որ միջազգային հանրության ուրեմն եւ ՄԱԿ-ի անվտանգության խորհրդի, այսպես ասած, կանխորոշիչ աշխատանքները մի փոքր այս պահին թերացած են եւ կոչերը դրանք իրավական պատասխանատվություն չեն ենթարկում եւ ինչ է կարծում, ինչ մեխանիզմներով կարելի է այսօր արդի ժամանակաշրջանում բարձրացնել ՄԱԿ-ի ազգային անվտանգության խորհրդի աշխատանքները նաեւ այս տարածաշրջանում, քանի որ մենք նույնպես շահագրգռված ենք, որ համահարթեցում ընթանա մարդու իրավունքների պաշտպանության կոնտեքստում։ Շնորհակալություն։
Listen, it was all on me. I got nothing. Yeah. Huh?
Չեն թարգմանում, հա, այսինքն։
Okay. There was a translator. Could the translator repeat the question? If not, one of us will just.
Կրկնեմ, հա, հարցս, այսինքն։ Հա, դե ուղղակի որ զգուշեցնեն, որ չի հասկանում, ես չի շարունակել, հա։
Your advice. Is there something that can be done to stop the torture and mutilation of Armenian soldiers in the current conflict? Number one. So what can be done? Could the Security Council intervene? The first question was about the Wilsonian Award way back in 1991. And the question is, should the Wilson mandate, what can be done about the Wilson mandate?
Okay.
Okay?
Okay.
And I think, maybe more generally what, maybe indigenous people's rights. Indigenous people's rights and what people have the rights to
Yeah.
the land, something along those lines.
Now, look, on the second question, which I gather had to do with violations of human rights that have taken place in the conflict with Azerbaijan with respect to Nagorno-Karabakh. The instrument that was established by the international community to try to deal with such matters is the International Criminal Court. Neither Armenia nor Azerbaijan is a party to the International Criminal Court. Therefore, the court does not have jurisdiction with respect to those abuses. In such cases, it is possible for the Security Council to refer a case to the International Criminal Court. That has happened on a few occasions. But it cannot happen if any one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council vetoes a resolution submitting a matter to the International Criminal Court. Armenia could invite the International Criminal Court to consider the case, and if there were crimes that took place on Armenian territory, that would give the International Criminal Court jurisdiction to deal with the matter. By its nature, the International Criminal Court would be concerned with abuses committed by both sides. There is another hurdle to overcome. Under the statute for the International Criminal Court, there is something that is referred to as a gravity test. The gravity test requires that the abuses that took place have to meet a certain level of gravity. Unfortunately, the statute for the International Criminal Court does not define when that level of gravity was reached. And one of the obstacles to the International Criminal Court consideration of the abuses that took place several years ago in the war between Russia and Georgia in South Ossetia was the gravity test. South Ossetia, as a legal matter, is part of Georgian territory. Georgia had ratified the statute for the International Criminal Court, and so the court had jurisdiction over the crimes that were committed in South Ossetia. And the court at that time was reluctant to go forward because it wasn't sure, or the prosecutor's office wasn't sure that it would meet the gravity test. And they did not want to indict a permanent member of the Security Council, Russia, for crimes committed unless it was a clear case that fit within the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, or at least that was the approach of the previous prosecutor for the International Criminal Court. Technically, the Georgia-Russia case is still alive, and I think the current prosecutor for the International Criminal Court is more inclined to proceed. But in what took place more recently, the number of deaths was smaller than what took place in the Georgia-Russia conflict. And so it's difficult for me to see how the International Criminal Court would move unless it also had moved by then on the Georgia-Russia matter. So I think the current obstacles to the possibility of dealing with this through the International Criminal Court are probably going to prevent that body from exercising jurisdiction in this matter. And that is essentially the only mechanism that the international community has for dealing with such matters. As far as Wilson's policies were concerned, we're now nearly 100 years after Wilson and his colleagues in Versailles divided up the world and specified, who gets what. There were many things that were done or at Versailles at that time which have not worked out well. For one thing, we were talking about Iraq a moment ago. Iraq was created by the peace process at Versailles, and 3 different territories were put together in order to form the state of Iraq. I think it's certainly beyond my capacity to say, how one ought to be able to revise at this date what took place a century ago at Versailles. I think that history plays out in ways that Wilson and company did not anticipate, and they were probably far too arrogant in their belief that they could divide up the world in an appropriate way. But I don't know how one can now deal with the consequences of their decisions. And as I say, it's beyond my capacity to address that issue. So I'm sorry to give you an unsatisfactory answer.
Thanks for us for your. Thank you.
One more on this side and one on this side? Or you have 2 there?
Yeah, please.
2 there,
The
1
last
here.
question. Samuel Garibian. No, in English. Samuel Garibian, AUA, Master of Laws, first-year student. Thank you very much for your important lecture. Even though it has been said that the truth can set us free, it is half-truths and incomplete narratives that can pose a greater danger. The danger with this technique is that the perpetrator gets off rather well, teaching one lesson, and the victim is left equated with the perpetrator. While this might give the impression with the human rights community of neutrality, it isn't. So I ask internally, within the Human Rights Watch, have you ever discussed the danger associated with the forced equated with the perpetrator and victim?
Human rights organizations, or at least those with which I have been associated, are very conscious of that problem and try very hard not to equate the perpetrator and the victim. But one also has to recognize that some people who are victims are also perpetrators. That some people who have been under attack and have been victimized have nevertheless themselves engaged in severe abuses. And the ultimate principle of the human rights movement is to deal with everything even-handedly, regardless of whether one sympathizes with the cause of those who engage in abuses. One has to denounce abuses according to the same standards. And the credibility of efforts to protect human rights depends upon the willingness to do that. In situations of victim and perpetrator, one is often dealing with armed conflicts. And the principal international legal standards for dealing with armed conflicts are the Geneva Conventions of 1949, supplemented by the 1977 protocols. And the standards of the Geneva Conventions and the protocols is regardless of whether somebody is the victim of aggression or in other ways a victim, if they engage in abuses, they must be held accountable. So that let's say that there is aggression by country A against country B, and then country B seizes people from country A and tortures them. Do you hold the people from country B who are the victims of aggression accountable for engaging in torture? And the answer is absolutely. You cannot allow the claim that someone is a victim to excuse them when they engage in human rights abuses. The United States considers itself the victim and is the victim of the attacks that took place on September 11. But that in no way legitimizes the torture of the detainees who were supposedly responsible for what took place in 9/11. The status of being a victim does not ever excuse human rights abuses.
Thank you.
Hello, I have another question. My question is how state terrorism can be stopped, for example, in Turkey against Kurds, like the destruction of Kurdish villages and towns.
No, this is a serious issue, and I think there had been a period in which those abuses had diminished. And it seemed to me that the abuses increased at the point that Erdogan did not get the majority he wanted in a round of elections, and that for his own electoral purposes, he fomented additional conflict with the Kurds and engaged in additional abuses against the Kurds. And I think he has to be denounced for that. The main way in which one deals with human rights abuses is by carefully documenting abuses, and then on the basis of careful documentation, denouncing those abuses. And two organizations, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, have been the leaders worldwide in documenting and denouncing abuses. And both of them have been active in the Turkish situation, as have others.
Okay.
Thank you.
Other questions? One more here.
Hi. My question is, what does it take for bigger human rights institutions to promote human rights movements to actually act upon terrorism in minority countries?
Actually, what?
Act upon?
Yeah.
In minority countries, taking the example of Paris attack against one day before the Beirut bombing attack.
I'm sorry, I'm not really following.
Okay. The example that was taken is the Paris attack, the bombings that happened, and a day previously there was a bombing in Beirut, and people didn't act the same way.
In response to the Beirut attack?
Yes. And how?
No, look, of course it is the case that in Western countries, there is many times more attention to terrorist attacks that take place in Western countries than there is when they take place in other parts of the world. There seem to be almost daily attacks in Iraq, and they are so frequent they get hardly any attention. There were huge attacks recently in Lahore, Pakistan, and the amount of attention that got in the West was tiny by comparison to the attacks that took place in Paris or Brussels. Most people in a country like the United States or a country like England, or many people in those countries, are regular visitors to places like Paris or Brussels. They never go to Lahore or to Beirut. And so those places are off the map as far as they are concerned. They don't pay much attention to what takes place. And I think that's very unfortunate. I think it's inappropriate, but I think it's also understandable that if there's an attack that were to take place at this university, you would pay far more attention than if an attack took place at some remote place. If an attack took place in China or India, you wouldn't pay the same attention as you would to an attack that took place right where you are or in a place to which you regularly travel. And I think one has to recognize that, and as I say, it's unfortunate, but it's understandable. Yes.
But isn't the concept of human rights movement is to promote human rights, whether the country, whether the place?
The human rights organizations try to get attention to what takes place in remote parts of the world. So if you look at, for instance, the reports of Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International, you will see that they publish great quantities of reports on what is taking place in South Sudan or the Central African Republic. But whatever they have to say about those attacks gets a tiny fraction of the attention of what they have to say about places that are more on the sort of international travel circuit. They try to overcome that problem, but they don't succeed.
Very good. Thank you all very much. I'd like to thank our speaker for the very, very important messages that he had today and gave us a lot to think about. Thanks to the audience for the great questions. Please join me in thanking him. Thank you all. I remind you that on Monday we have another lecture, this time on Rwanda. We look forward